session. We're going to be looking at two policy proposals, the academic proposal, academic IPv4 allocation proposal, and the WIS database update process proposal. Then we'll look at the RPM document, that is the resource policy manual document. NST is going to provide a status report on that, and then it will also provide a policy implementation status report. So I'm going to call on Andrew to present his policy. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm hoping halfway through this presentation my co-author will join me, particularly because I'm not feeling too well and my voice is going, so if you stop being able to hear me or understand me, please let me know. Okay, so the academic IPv4 policy. This policy was originally drafted in 2013 by myself and Sunday, and the idea behind this policy was to make it easier for academic institutions to gain access to IPv4 resources. In our view, it was fairly difficult to get hold of space, particularly when you were talking about the large blocks that academic institutions require. And we felt that this was a good use of IPv4 space, considering the amount of IPv4 space that Afrinic is sitting on, which at the moment is actually delaying the African burn of IPv4 space, which in turn, in our opinion, is delaying the IPv6 rollouts. We were also of the opinion that sooner or later we'd end up in a situation where the African IP resources were being pillaged and taken off continent, no matter how we tried to stop it, unless it was allocated to African institutions. And as such, this policy was there to ensure that Africa actually kept its IP space in the hands of responsible institutions that could actually use it. As you can see, the submission date on this was the 26th of July 2013, is on the current version just after the last AGM, where we did do a couple of modifications, which I'll talk about later, as requested by the community. What we were trying to do here is say that in an academic institution, particularly a large university, where you're sitting with a situation where they are rolling out large Wi-Fi rollouts, it becomes very difficult using infrastructure alone to justify how much space you give to a university. Because, for example, a university that's just rolled out 4,000 access points could potentially have 60 to 70,000 devices connected behind those access points. I myself here today am carrying 3 phones, a notebook, and an iPad. Bang, that's 5 IPs. And so what we were trying to say is, where the justification becomes very difficult, let's use a simple formula to calculate this and then base it on what the population on the campus actually is. So take the number of full-time students, the number of full-time employees, and then half the number of part-time students, and then apply a multiplier to it and say that is what the institution qualifies for. We said originally that we wanted a ratio of, I believe it was 3, and the community actually came back on the list and said they wanted it higher. But there's been quite a bit of debate about that. We also insisted under this policy that the institution must have a plan to provide IPv6 connectivity. So if you want space under this policy, you've got to demonstrate to Afrinic that you have serious IPv6 plans and want to proceed with IPv6, have the blocks, and have an ability to roll it out. We changed the word academic to higher education institutions. That was for clarity's sake and to just clean things up. It was one of the changes requested by the community. And then originally there was a minimum ratio that you could get space at. And one of the things the community said to us was that there are cases where institutions might seriously not want that much space. So we put something in there that allowed you to reduce the number of IPs, but you have a default minimum that you would get based on the formula I described earlier. This is basically a bit of a summary of where we are sitting at the moment. Time after time, I'm seeing higher education institutions running behind a single IP address. Now, in a research environment, NAT simply doesn't work. The end-to-end connectivity that isn't there is vastly limiting in many, many research applications, and it holds the institutions back. It actually also gets kind of expensive to have firewalls that can process the amount of NAT to cope with 40, 50, 60,000 students, as we are seeing. You end up with a lot of problems with connectivity back into the institution. So where students are collaborating with outside and they need bidirectional communication, the NAT causes a lot of problems. To highlight this, one of the universities, University of the Free State, applied for and was granted a /15 on top of their /16 legacy. And I was at that campus. We rolled that space out in the space of about 3 weeks, and today that space is 99% utilized. You've got maybe 2 /24s in a /15 and a /16 combined, put together, being actively used. And it drastically changed the ability of the campus to do various things. But it was a long, long, hard process to get that. And they actually still need more space, but are struggling to get more. As I said, the migration away from NAT, it promotes technologies such as multicast, the convergence of voice and data networks, and that also drives down cost in the institutions. By eliminating NAT, you help promote IPv6, an institution that is sitting largely behind NAT. When you're trying to roll out NAT on your, trying to roll out IPv6 behind something that's doing NAT for your v4, you're forced into multi-topologies, and that gets rather messy. It complicates things, and it's hurting the deployment of IPv6 within the academic institutions. Giving IPv4 space to these institutions actually ends up helping promote what should be our end game, and that is the adoption of IPv6. Another example of this, I might add, that when we were redoing the University of the Free State, without the /15 worth of new address space that was given to the university by Afrinic, redesigning and redeploying that network away from the single layer 2 domain it was before then into a routed and segmented network would have been impossible. And I've done presentations in the past about that migration that clearly show it would have been impossible, and without that migration, the v6 deployment would have been impossible. So giving out v4 doesn't necessarily not promote v6, it helps. As I said, the proposal simplifies the allocation of address space. It recognizes higher education institutions as end users, because there were previously arguments about LIRs versus whether they were LIRs or weren't they LIRs. This proposal says they're not LIRs. Academic institutions are functional end entities, as would be a bank or a corporate. And that was after quite a bit of discussion, I might add, that we added that, but it does reduce some confusion. As I said, it helps reduce the dependence on NAT, and it encourages IPv6 adoption. We put a bunch of qualifying requirements in here to say that if they want to qualify for space under this, they need to provide proof of the institution's registration and accreditation, proof of the number of registered full-time students, and proof of the staff headcount. In most higher education institutions, all of those things are audited. So you can actually get that out of various official points that create official documentation. It's not, we chose those things because it's not information that an institution can readily just fudge. And then we said that the policy applies a ratio of the head count of campus users, as I said, with the formula that we've got. Interestingly enough, the part-time students figure should also be audited. They would also have to provide proof of that. I said the IPv6, we'd require it in addition to the documentation. They need to show a very detailed plan of current or planned IPv6 rollouts with committed timeframes. And we said that the rollout of IPv6 can only be considered a true rollout if it's extended to the edge of the network. So an institution that enables a couple of core switches with IPv6 would not qualify under this because their plans do not demonstrate categorically that they're taking it to the edge. Unless it's to the edge, you don't have a v6 rollout. And we said there that they're allowed to receive IPv4 addresses at a ratio not less than 5 IPv4 addresses per campus user, where campus user is defined in 3.2. And note, we said they shall be eligible. They can request a lower ratio if they so choose. As per 3.6, we can, that's the minimum accepted ratio, but you can ask for less as well as go as high as 10 to 1 should there be more justification. As I said, they're classified as end users, so we've been through that point there. We've said that if Afrinic is extending discounts to higher education institutions, this policy is covered under the same academic discounts that Afrinic extends. It doesn't change that. It doesn't ask for more discount. It simply says if Afrinic is extending discounts to academic institutions, then the same discounts should apply. And the policy dispenses for the need of higher education institutions to provide masses of detailed proof of equipment and infrastructure. The reason for that, as I said, is a lot of these campuses are working on Wi-Fi networks very, very hard to justify space on Wi-Fi networks without using some kind of concurrency figures. You find that these institutions are so large that when Afrinic asks for proof of every switch on campus, you could easily be looking at 1,000 invoices. And that becomes very, very time consuming and very difficult to process. So we're basically saying that by dint of the fact that these institutions already have 50, 60,000 students, they have to have infrastructure to support these students. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the students. The students have to be able to learn, they have to have infrastructure, and as such, the infrastructure is assumed. Then a couple of the previous comments, as you said, some of the postings opposed codifying a ratio into the policy. We changed the ratio to say that you can go below the minimum and set a maximum. So there is a ratio, but there is some flexibility in there. As we said, Afrinic in the past has refused network plans based on the needs, refused network plans based on Wi-Fi rollouts, etc., and being unable to prove concurrency. That has happened in the past. University of Pretoria is one such example where we did have that happen. We did have some people saying, why only HEIs? Why can't it apply to hospitals, schools, etc.? We chose to focus on the higher education institutes in this policy because of their large student base, which is known, it's auditable, but the nature of the institution defines that the infrastructure has to be there, and it was easier to limit the policy for this, but it does not stop anybody, I might add, writing a similar policy for schools, and if the community feels that it should be passed, by all means. We just chose to limit the scope of this because it made the documentation aspects of it a lot easier to work with. There were some suggestions on the list that, well, net the student devices. This was opposed in previous comments by various people, and I myself oppose this. I do think that it does limit what the student can do in many ways by removing the end-to-end communications. There were different ratios proposed, etc. So we made it rather flexible. You can ask for less than 5, you can go up to 10. It's kind of flexible there. And there was a suggestion that the ratios apply to the richer institutions in South Africa, which does not reflect the situation Africa-wide. Let me tell you something. We have institutions today far beyond Africa that have that kind of student count. The proof is in the traffic. Look at the Kenyan National Research Network, which last I looked was doing 1.3 gigabit per second from Google, which is equivalent to what the South African institutions, or fairly close to what the South African institutions are doing. There is now fiber optic cable available into Rwanda and into Uganda. The UbuntuNet Alliance is running STM4s from South Africa to Zambia, I believe, to Kenya, to Uganda, to Rwanda. So these academic institutions are coming online. They do have the bandwidth and the infrastructure to make use of these resources. And what's more, as they grow, we shouldn't be limiting them today. But the reality is the infrastructure is there, and it's far, far beyond South Africa, and there is plenty of proof of that. There's a comment that universities may start hoarding IP addresses if they qualify for much more than they need. Well, I suppose it's potentially possible, but then again, I suppose that anybody could start hoarding IP addresses. And would we rather have a massive unused IP pool that is sitting in the Afrinic pool, unallocated, with an incredibly slow allocation rate, slowing down IPv6 allocation, where one of two things happens. Either it continues to sit there and Afrinic is not generating any finance from it, and considering the financial positions at the moment, well, the finance is needed, or alternatively, give it to the higher education institutes, or somebody from off-continent will come and get it. Now, Sunday and I highlighted the fact that space would start disappearing off-continent. While there is no fixed, concrete evidence that this is necessarily happening, I point to the fact that currently there is a /12 or 13 out there allocated by Afrinic. The contact numbers in that space are all with Chinese country codes. There was a mail by a deal to the list earlier this month, which refers to fraudulent applications. The comments that up here today have alluded to the fact that Afrinic is getting these fraudulent applications. Some are caught, some aren't, and the space goes out, and then the fight starts to try and get the space back. We are saying, don't let the rest of the world pillage our IP space, don't let it get stolen, rather let higher education use it in a responsible manner that keeps the African resources where they belong, with the African people under control of African institutions. And that is one of our arguments for this policy as well. There were some posters who said the policy will be regionally beneficial. Nobody really justified that, if I remember. Sunday, do you remember any justification for that that was put on the list?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, there's a note in here that top point that some posters said it would only be regionally beneficial, and I'm just trying to remember how that was justified on the list, because I can't remember what the justifications were for those comments.
I am trying to forget justifications against our proposal. But seriously, I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there were other people who...
I mean, a lot of objections were just objections, not with reasons.
Okay, I think it would be more helpful to just run through the comments that were made, then we can then start taking questions and discussions.
There were other people who said that the regional nature doesn't really apply, and the origin of the proposed authors says it all. Basically, I was from South Africa when I wrote this policy. I'm still originally from South Africa, but I now live in Kenya. I still support the policy. Sunday, my co-author, is from Nigeria. It's spread across the continent, and we don't believe that this policy actually gives anything more to one region than the other. In fact, we would argue that this policy actually advantages the sections of the continent that have very few addresses. I mean, there's a university, I believe, in Ethiopia running behind one IP address. They're the guys who need to take advantage of this policy. It's not the South African institutions who are sitting with /16s and /15s. They're not the ones that need this policy. It is the institutions that have been historically disadvantaged that need this, and it is for those institutions that this policy really exists. There were others say, some people said other ways to get academic IP resource users to move to V6 should be sought. Well, yes, I believe that every possible way to get people to move to IPv6 should be actively sought out. But that doesn't detract from the fact that this policy is one such way to actually get people to move to V6. And just because there might be other ways doesn't detract from the solutions that we are offering. Some say that some people said that the allocation of IP resources for HEIs who wish to apply using this policy should be done in phases. The problem with that is, what are the phases? What are the boundaries? Where do you know when somebody's used it? Do we go back into the constant fight for documentation again, which becomes more and more difficult because you can't justify the number of concurrent users? There was an indication that this policy will not make Afrinic financially sustainable. Let me comment a little bit on this. Currently, as we all know, was stated at the AGM last year, without this policy, Afrinic made, by their financials, a 7.8 million rupee loss due to write-down of bad debts, was the comment submitted by the board. Now, one thing about higher education institutions, they generally pay their bills. I've worked in that sector for a long time, and higher education institutions, because of the nature of what they are and the size of them, you very seldom see a problem with that. You also look at the fact that the current IP pool within Afrinic is sitting stagnant. It's not really being allocated at anywhere close to the rate that the rest of the continent is getting, well, the rest of the world is taking space. So while it sits in that pool, Afrinic sits not generating a single cent from those IPs. And considering the financial state of Afrinic, don't we want to say, let them take the space and give us some money so that Afrinic is financially sustainable, rather than getting nothing because Afrinic itself is hoarding those IPs, waiting for, well, I don't know what they're waiting for, but let's get those IPs out of there and get them with somebody actually contributing towards Afrinic by using them. there were people who noted that some of the recommendations made to the authors could make the proposal acceptable, and we were taking them in an opposing manner. We looked and thought through each and every comment. Believe me, Sunday and I spent substantial amounts of time discussing this. If we hadn't done that and we didn't believe in this policy, we wouldn't be back up here today presenting this policy again. Where we felt that the comments were applicable and where we felt that the community really wanted those with regards to the ratios, etc., there were adjustments to this policy made. The comment that most of the previous comments before AFRINIC 18 were also re-echoed on the mailing list during the last call period, I actually don't know that I agree with that comment. Sorry, chairs, but I actually would like to see a justification of that, because when Sunday and I drafted this policy before AFRINIC 18, we were fairly careful to take into account, and I also point out that during AFRINIC 18, when consensus was called on this, there was a very large consensus, and it was only after that meeting that comments in anti this proposal started appearing on the lists. So I'm not sure that I agree with that last point, but that's just my thoughts. I'll let my co-author comment on that in a second. And then the policy, Sunday and I have always argued that this policy has fair distribution across Africa. The fair distribution is the fact that this policy helps those that are previously disadvantaged. It does not help those who already have IP space because they already have it. It's designed to give people who have no address space an ability to access it and grow with that space as time goes forward. So this policy does give a far fairer approach than the guys who are sitting with loads and loads of legacy space. And by the way, the guys who are sitting with loads of legacy space, just as a matter of record, don't have to contribute financially to the running of AFRINIC in the same way that people under this policy would. So what we're saying is, why are people sitting with loads of address space? They're not contributing, but the other people who are sitting there with one IP address, sitting everything behind that, can't get space. Let's give them some space as well. Yes, they've got to contribute towards AFRINIC, and perhaps legacy members should have to contribute the same amount as other members. That's a matter for another policy. But let's give the people who don't have the space some space. We received consensus to move to last call at AFRINIC 18. We didn't receive consensus in the last call period. It went back to the further discussions. We represented it at AFRINIC 19. Unfortunately, I wasn't there. We didn't get the consensus at AFRINIC 19. It was sent back to the list for further discussion. But if I remember correctly, there were not, in fact, I don't think there were any comments after AFRINIC 19 on the list. And so here we are back again here, trying again, because we still do believe in the validity of this policy.
That's fine, thank you.
Sunday, can Sunday make a couple of comments? He's my co-author, please.